first, I would like to say thank you for everybody who's participating. SCRIBO is proving quite successful, and we're streaming on Facebook as well, so that to take part and to be streaming live on the platform through Facebook, loads of other people can join and listen to our beloved guests speaking. And today I'm particularly happy because Philippa Steele is known as Pippa to me, and she's a dear friend and colleague, and we've shared so much knowledge with each other that it was really second nature to invite her straight away to speak for us. And this is our fourth SCRIBO seminar. And Pippa is going to be talking about a case of a very sort of enigmatic writing system that we learned from the second millennium BC Cyprus. So we're moving away from Crete, and we're sort of, engaging with another island of the Mediterranean. And her title is going to be Where Writing Practices Meet Writing Systems. Pippa needs no introduction. She is the principal investigator of a wonderful ERC project funded by the European Commission called CRUISE, Context of and Relations Between Early Writing Systems. And her knowledge of writing systems from both the second millennium Aegean, but also first millennium Levant and the early Greek alphabet is stupendous, is magnificent. And she is also a very prolific writer. She's written how many books, Pippa? 5? The edited books as well. And for such a young researcher, it really is an outstanding output. And I've been privileged to contribute to 2 of her edited books, a chapter on Superminon, in fact, and one on the alphabet in Ugarit. And she's written these 2 wonderful edited books, which bear 2 very similar titles, Understanding Relations Between Scripts. But the first volume dealt with the second millennium Aegean scripts and their relations, so Cretan hieroglyphic, Linear A, and Superminon mainly. And the second book, Understanding Relations Between Scripts, volume 2, dealt with the early alphabet. So really, her outlook is particularly interdisciplinary because she was born a linguist, but she's also expanded on more of an anthropological, I would say, contextual and also archaeological standpoint in dealing with the power of writing systems and the history of writing at large. And today she's going to be talking about a theoretical modeling of how writing was used on Cyprus in the second millennium BC, but also how it was practically perceived by the population of the island during the late Bronze Age. So without any more introduction, which is really not needed, over to you, Pippa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. I'll start off by sharing my screen if I can. How's that? Is that better?
Yes.
Right. Very good. Here we go. So hopefully everyone can see the PowerPoint now. So I'd like to start by thanking Sylvia for this lovely invitation. It's a real honour to be speaking in this series. And actually, I'd also like to thank Miguel for the lovely poster. And I think he did a great job with Photoshop on those rings as well. So that you can see I've got one of the hands here with it's one of the Cypro-Minoan gold rings photoshopped in, which is very nice. And I owe great thanks to the European Research Council, which funds both Sylvia's project Inscribe and my project CRUISE. And it just allows such wonderful research to go on in the humanities, and it's a real privilege to be funded by the ERC. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about, I'm going to start with theoretical kind of perspectives and move on to this kind of case study of Cypro-Minoan. But I wanted to start by saying a little bit about the CRUISE project and sort of who we are, what we do, and sort of what the founding principles of our research essentially is. So CRUISE stands for contexts of and relations between early writing systems. And we're focusing deliberately on the 2nd and 1st millennia BC. So not looking really at the sort of inception, but actually looking at writing in a period when there were very high levels of mobility and cultural contact around the areas we're interested in, namely the Aegean, the Eastern Mediterranean, the Near East, and North Africa. So I sort of head the team and I work on writing systems and practices in the Bronze Age Aegean. And then working with me, I have so Natalia Elvira Astoreka, who actually is very close to her viva for her PhD. She's been working on the development of early Greek alphabets, so the regional alphabets that develop in the early days of Greek alphabetic writing. Philip Boyes working on the social context of writing at Ugarit and taking predominantly archaeological approaches, and Robert Krellin working on the sort of representation of language units. So he was looking at vowel writing and now looking at sort of larger linguistic units encoded in a variety of writing systems, including the West Semitic alphabets and also Egyptian hieroglyphs. So interdisciplinarity is really important to the project, not just because we're all working on slightly different groups of material, or because we're taking different or slightly different, or in some cases very different disciplinary approaches, but also in that one of the kind of founding principles of the project was the idea that those different approaches can work together. And when I sort of first had the idea for having a project looking at different writing systems, that was very important to me, to really think about where some of these disciplinary approaches can meet up, because we don't always think of them in that way. I'm quite lucky actually working on the Bronze Age Aegean, where I think scholarship really has displayed some very impressively joined up thinking. But there are other areas of the ancient world where, you know, different disciplines are sort of kept really quite separate. Let's start with writing as a system and linguistic kind of approaches to writing. So thinking of writing as a system typically involves focusing on what the repertoire of signs is in that writing system and what the linguistic value of those signs is. So there's an interest in the ways in which writing systems encode languages. There are various terms for this as a discipline. I quite like grapholinguistics because it sort of does what it says on the tin. But there's a great deal of scholarship that has been, and over recent years has really been building up as well. And because writing systems can essentially encode language in different ways, that involves thinking about phonology, morphology, lexicology, syntax, semantics. And it's also worth remembering that writing systems can encode in more than one way at once. There has been a long-standing and now still growing interest in the typology of writing systems. So thinking about how you can group different writing systems into different types in terms of the way in which they encode languages. Now, from the beginning, I want to pose a question that is quite deeply rooted in Cruz as a project, namely, how are writing systems related to each other? Okay, now, if we look at this from the sort of linguistic and typological perspective, One way in which we might envisage writing systems as being related to each other is to think of them in terms of sort of family trees, almost genetic kind of modelling. So I'm thinking here of something quite similar to what a historical linguist might do with a group of languages. In a sense, I would say that this is more of a kind of convenient fiction. Even for languages, actually, you know, it's sort of an abstraction to view them in a family tree in this way, but it can sometimes be useful. Now, here as an example, I've used the so the alphabet's derived from Phoenician and its ancestor. We could call these, broadly speaking, phonemographic. Personally, I would just call them all alphabets. But in terms of linguistic typology, some scholars would argue that you have different types of writing system depending on the degree to which vowels are encoded. So these are all writing systems that encode phoneme by phoneme, which is to say there's a single sign for a single sound, broadly speaking. But originally, and for some of the later ones in this family tree, you have systems that only encode consonants, or in some cases mostly encode consonants. And that has led to a kind of distinction between true alphabets, so ones that encode both vowels and consonants, and on the other hand, abjads, so ones that only encode consonants and don't encode vowels. But I think it's fair to say that recent scholarship is sort of beginning to appreciate that the degree to which vowels are encoded in these phonemographic systems is actually more of a scale than an either-or scenario. So actually it's a little bit more complicated than that. But in terms of envisaging the relationships, I suppose what you're doing by building a tree like this is to think of them as fairly straightforward relationships. So you can neatly divide up the branches and cast each one as an ancestor or as a descendant. So it can be a descendant of one script and then an ancestor of another. That does seem quite a simplistic way of looking at things, but as I say, can be a useful kind of abstraction in some cases. I should say that I'm not awfully attached to the way in which this particular family tree is laid out. I think there are various points here where you could kind of quibble with the details, and not all of these relationships are really as straightforward or as well understood as a tree like this might imply. The way in which you kind of decide what is descended from what, again, I suppose, follows that kind of historical linguistic model. So you think about shared features, and then descendant scripts have innovated in some way. Now, most of these relationships look relatively straightforward, but at the top of the tree, I've tried to mark out something that's a little bit more controversial, namely the relationship between Proto-Semitic, that is the ancestor of the Phoenician alphabet, the relationship between that and Egyptian hieroglyphs. And the reason I put two question marks there is not that there is really any doubt that there's a relationship with Egyptian hieroglyphs. It's rather that the nature of the relationship is quite different. And so for all of the other writing systems in this family tree, you could say that the relationship is quite straightforward and that there isn't really very much in terms of system change other than the degree to which vowels are notated in the different systems. The relationship between Proto-Semitic and Egyptian hieroglyphs is quite different. So here we have a much more striking example of system change I'll show this inscription, which is the most photogenic of the Proto-Semitic inscriptions. Now, Egyptian hieroglyphs encode language in a different way to the phonemographic alphabetic systems we've just seen. That is to say, they have a larger repertoire of signs. Originally, the principle was clearly logographic, but essentially each sign in Egyptian hieroglyphs can represent single, double, or triple consonants. And what Proto-Semitic does is to narrow that down and to just streamline to the signs that represent single consonants. But at the same time, there is also a kind of linguistic creativity with values assigned on a kind of acrophonic principle based on not Egyptian language, but on the language spoken by the people adapting this script, namely a Northwest Semitic or a West Semitic language, which is in some sense an ancestor of Phoenician. Unfortunately, we don't have that many attestations of this stage of writing, so there are actually a lot of unknowns about Proto-Semitic, but we do at least have a pretty decent working knowledge of both kind of how it must work and where it's headed later on. Okay, so that raises a bit of a complication when thinking about relationships between writing systems. So clearly not all transfers of writing can be put down to a simple kind of borrowing situation of the type that we see between some of the alphabetic systems. Some of those borrowings actually involve significant reimagining, significant creativity. And it's also, I think, very important to remember that writing is not a purely linguistic phenomenon. Okay, and that brings us on to practices. Since I promised to speak about where writing systems meet writing practices. Okay, so what do I mean by practices? Well, we can think of writing as a practice in as much as it is a thing that you do. So we can approach the production of writing and also its consumption. And that involves, especially for these writing systems that are no longer in use, looking at their archaeological and material context to try to understand how they were used. It can involve looking at the material properties of inscribed objects, and also at choices being made in the process of writing. So choices about the media that you write on, the implements that you write with, the methods of writing, by which I basically mean how do you apply the implement to the medium. More broadly, we can also think about the place of inscribed objects in society. So there's been some work on the agency of inscribed objects, for example, their place in wider social settings, and the social context of writing practices, because writing is only one practice that is ongoing in any given social setting, and it will be interacting with lots of other practices. And that also means that it will meet with different perceptions. It will be practiced by certain groups of people. It may be inclusive or exclusive, and there are lots of different possibilities about how writing will work in a social setting. Okay, so this slide was just to give a sort of visual idea of what I mean. So if you think about the physical properties of documents, their material properties, you look at their archaeological and their social context, then you can start to build up a kind of composite picture, a kind of reconstruction of writing practices. Well, you don't have to do this in Lego, but you could if you wanted to. The Lego picture actually comes from a blog post that I wrote a little while ago, where I wanted to sort of do something in terms of outreach and sort of make it a bit more accessible to the wider public. So I use Lego as a medium, but really what I was doing was to explore this idea that we can kind of build up a composite picture from looking at various pieces of evidence that we have. Now, one area of study that brings both the system approach and the practices approach together is in the area of paleography. Okay, so consider a situation where you have an undeciphered writing system. Now that means that there may be considerable numbers of unknowns concerning the sign to language correspondence. So you may, I mean, you may not know at what level language is being encoded in the first place. You may not know what the values of each of the signs is. You may not know what the underlying language is. All of those factors could be unknown. That means that essentially all you can do to begin with is to study for patterns in the signs. So to look for patterns in the sequences that are recorded. The main problem is that this only works if you understand the overall repertoire of signs well. So if you think of a writing system like Linear B used in Mycenaean Greece in the late Bronze Age, this is a very good example of a writing system that was decoded in exactly this way. It was studied for patterns, and it was by observation of patterns that the eventual decipherment was achieved. But the thing is that for Linear B, we have more than 6,000 documents. We have lots and lots of examples. Some of them, a lot of them are sort of reasonably lengthy in comparison to inscriptions in other areas of the Mediterranean, as we'll see. That also means that for any given sign in Linear B, for most of them, we have lots and lots of examples of that sign. And that means that we also understand a lot about the ways in which an individual sign can vary in shape, for example. Now, if you're in a more difficult position, for instance, you have a lot fewer inscriptions, then it is much more difficult to make progress in this way. And that brings us on to the case study that I want to focus on now for the rest of this talk, namely Cypro-Minoan. So Cypro-Minoan is our term for writing in late Bronze Age Cyprus between around the 16th and around the 10th century BC. Now, for Cypro-Minoan, we only have around 250 inscriptions, and most of them actually are very short. So there are very few that are longer than maybe 10 signs or so. And added together, that means that we really need to pay very close attention to the paleographic and the material features of the inscriptions, because that is absolutely essential to establishing the nature of the sign repertoire. And this has been a really contentious issue in scholarship over the years. So here you can see a number of different Cypro-Minoan inscriptions. I have to thank Sylvia for being very generous with photographs, which is very wonderful, and makes the study of Cypro-Minoan much more accessible. We can see here a number of different techniques used for writing on objects with Cypro-Minoan inscriptions. So there's a clay tablet, a clay ball. Both of those would have been inscribed while the clay was wet. Then you have inscriptions on metal in the gold ring and in the ingot, where you would need a sort of sharp pointed tool to apply the inscriptions, but in a very different way from how you might have writing on wet clay. The bottom middle is a scratched inscription on a piece of pre-fired clay from a pot. And then top right, we have a cylinder seal, and cylinder seals are any little things. So the ways in which inscriptions are applied is going again to differ greatly. This is made of some kind of stone, I guess that's steatite, which is admittedly a soft stone, but that doesn't mean that it's easy to inscribe tiny pictures and bits of writing on. I actually had an experiment recently with making a cylinder seal, which turned out okay, though I did use a power tool to do it. I'm not sure how I would have done it otherwise. Now, you can see that when you have a great variety of inscribed objects, of methods of applying the inscription, and you also have media that make it necessary to inscribe in different ways, or maybe to make signs more or less angular, to make them larger or smaller. All of those are factors that affect the shapes of signs. Now, if you had plenty of inscriptions to work on, fair enough, then you might still have a good idea of kind of how to reconcile those issues. But as it is, with only 250 inscriptions, we're left with a lot of problems. So in Cypro-Minoan scholarship, there has been an ongoing debate about how many signs there are in Cypro-Minoan, whether you can divide it up, whether there's just one tradition of writing or multiple traditions of writing. I've got here a table from Miguel Valerio's doctoral thesis. There's a link to the side there. I can send the PowerPoint to anyone who wants it, by the way, so just let me know. Now, here we can see, so what Miguel has done is to sort of pay attention to paleographic features in order to try and draw up a kind of unified version of the signary, so one that takes into account potential paleographic variation. And you can see that for each of these signs, most of them actually have different variants, and those variants are sometimes really quite different from each other and sometimes not so different. But if you imagine that many of those variants have very small numbers of attestations, then you can then sort of see how difficult it is to draw up a kind of sign repertoire for Cypro-Minoan. Now, I don't really intend to talk much about sign repertoire, but I did want to highlight another couple of bits of kind of current research that are going on by two amazing scholars who have played a role in the Cruise project as well, who have both visited us as our visiting fellows. So we have a kind of visiting fellowship program that allows scholars to come and spend a bit of time with us and hopefully to kind of benefit from intellectual exchange. So one is Cassie Donnelly, who visited us last year, and she is working on pot marks, on Cypriot pot marks, and that is very interesting actually, because there are lots of single sign inscriptions which traditionally have been excluded from the corpus of Cypro-Minoan, because a single sign on its own, in theory, couldn't be any use for working out anything about the writing system. I think that sort of at its basis is really a mistake, and it's really good to see someone trying to sort of take into account all of these other attestations that must be linked to the overall repertoire of Cypro-Minoan, even if they might be difficult to reconcile with it. And the other is Martina Pollig, who visited us earlier this year, just in time to have an actual physical visit in person, thankfully. And she has been working on the forthcoming corpus of Cypro Minoan in conjunction with Massimo Perna. And she has been taking 3D scans of as many of the Cypro Minoan objects as possible. And that is really wonderful, actually, because her scans have amazing detail. It was such a joy sitting down with her and having a look at the close-ups of some of these scans. So for something like this clay tablet here, thank you to Martina for letting me show this image of one of her scans. You can zoom right in, you can look at the signs from different angles, you can measure the impressions and so on. And that really gives so much more detail than is possible from a photograph or even possible from autopsy. You know, it really does help to sort out a lot of issues related to paleography. So it's really good to see projects like this going on. Okay, so back to Cypro Minoan in theory. Now, as I said before, sometimes a family tree can be a kind of useful abstraction for how we think of relationships between writing systems. I think that's especially true for Cypro Minoan because it sort of helps us to understand why we feel we have some certainty about some aspects of Cypro Minoan and not about others. So Cypro Minoan is clearly in some sense derived from or based on writing from Minoan Crete, that is Linear A. It's difficult to know exactly how that kind of transfer occurred or what exactly was the nature of the adoption of writing. But in terms of timescale and in terms of the sort of sign shapes in the earliest Cypro Minoan documents, I think we can have no doubt really that this is coming directly from the tradition of writing in Minoan Crete. Now, Linear A is undeciphered like Cypro Minoan, but Linear A has another descendant script, as it were, namely Linear B. And Linear B is the deciphered one, so we know that this encodes an early form of Greek, and we understand it very well. So we know that it encodes by open syllable, that every sign represents either a vowel on its own or a combination of consonant and vowel, in a small number of cases, 2 consonants and a vowel. At the other end, so Linear B is used in the late Bronze Age. Over on Cyprus, Cypro Minoan is used throughout the late Bronze Age and sort of into the early Iron Age. And then following that, definitely from the 8th century BC onwards, we have a system in use in Cyprus that is usually referred to as the Cypriot syllabic script or the Cypriot syllabary. And that again was used to write Greek. Not only Greek, there's at least one, I guess probably native language, Etio-Cypriot, that is written in this system. But the Cypriot Greek dialect is written in this system too, and we can actually understand that very well. In fact, this one was deciphered before Linear B was, so it was deciphered in the 19th century. Whereas Linear B, of course, was deciphered in the 1950s. Now, the Cypriot syllabic script does have some differences from Linear B in terms of orthography. That is to say that given a particular Greek word, you might make different choices about how to spell it in the 2 systems. It also has a couple of differences in terms of repertoire, but mainly this is to do with being a different stage of language. So this is a slightly different variety of Greek. And also perhaps Cypro-Minoan has intervened in some way to make some differences to the way that consonants are distributed in the writing system. But essentially, it is exactly the same in the way it encodes language. Again, it's encoding in terms of open syllables, so vowel or consonant plus vowel combinations. And really strikingly, there are a small number of signs that are common to Linear B and the Cypriot syllabic script that also share their value. So they share both shape and value. And that is a really strong testament to the kind of relationship between this family of writing systems, because Cypro-Minoan must be the immediate kind of ancestor, if you like, of the Cypriot syllabic script. And if that is the case, then the Cypriot syllabic script must have inherited those features from Cypro-Minoan. And that means that we know how Cypro-Minoan encodes language, even if we don't know what language is encoded. And it also means that we know some of the values of the signs. And the degree to which you're willing to reconstruct the values of Cypro-Minoan signs, well, it varies from scholar to scholar. But I don't intend to approach that question today. I think it's sufficient to say that, you know, we have a decent understanding of how Cypro-Minoan is related to these other scripts as a system. Okay, but how about practices? So here we have the earliest of Cypro-Minoan tablets. And I'm mostly going to talk about clay tablets now because I think they give some nice examples of kind of variable factors in Cypro-Minoan writing practices. So this is the earliest one, and in a sense the most Linear A looking one. It was found at Enkemi, so a site in the east of Cyprus, and dates to maybe the 16th or 15th century BC. Its exact dating is difficult. It is so different looking from the repertoire of most of the later Cypro-Minoan inscriptions that it has sometimes been classified as a separate script altogether. Again, I don't want to approach these issues. Miguel has written plenty on this, actually. And I think it's fair to say that we can see where the links are, even if it's difficult to say kind of what did the writing tradition look like at the time when this tablet was produced. So that's why it's labelled CM0, because it has been sometimes given that label in scholarship. Here is some Linear A just to compare. As you can see, the methods of writing are reasonably similar looking. So these are both clay tablets. However, the Cypro-Minoan clay tablet is really quite different in shape. It's very thick as well, this tablet, very, very kind of strange. And it also has two signs on the edge as well, which seem to repeat two signs on the tablet and probably give a kind of external view of what the content of the tablet is, as a guess. I'm afraid my zoom in on this one is a little bit fuzzy looking, but the idea is to give you an impression of what it looks like when written kind of close up. We'll come back to that because I have some points to make about this tablet and about some of the others. What I would say about Linear A at this point while I'm showing this picture is that for Linear A, we can be reasonably certain that the implement that was used to write Linear A tablets was a very sharp, pointed, rounded tool. Okay, so it was round in the cross section, a very probably long, thin, sharp point. Now, in Cambridge, we're quite keen on experiments, and a couple of years ago now, quite a while ago now, actually. We had a sort of Linear A self-help group where we tried, among other things, writing with different implements to see sort of how things would turn out. And trying an acacia thorn turned out to work really, really well. Acacia thorns are surprisingly big and are very hard and pointed. So something really sharp, I think, was probably used to write a lot of Linear A documents. Here are another couple of Cypro-Minoan tablets, showing these two side by side to emphasize how much difference there can be between different examples. We only have a handful of Cypro-Minoan tablets anyway, so we don't have large numbers to compare, and it's very difficult to know how representative any one tablet is of what might have been a more widespread tradition at the time. So on the left, a tablet from Enkemi again, but a slightly later period, a period when we have much more Cypro-Minoan surviving. And on the right, one from Pila, which was quite a recent discovery. I've tried to give a sense of the relative size of those two tablets. So the one on the left is, I think, under 10 centimeters in height, whereas the one on the right is more than 20 in height, 22 or 3, something like that. So you're looking at least a kind of piece of A5 paper, that sort of size. So yeah, so quite big. You can see again that there are little labels, CM2 and CM1. That is just to hint towards, again, this idea that the repertoire of Cypro-Minoan can be broken up into different traditions. This is largely found in the scholarship of Emilia Masson, who thought that CM2, so exclusively the writing found in this tablet and in 3 other tablets or fragments from the same site, the idea that they might be written in a slightly different repertoire from the rest of Cypro-Minoan inscriptions. And then on the right, CM1 was kind of a catch-all term for Masson, for basically anything that didn't fall into one of her special groups. And you could say this one is much more CM1 looking, I guess. The size of the signs is very different. There is a lot more kind of drawing of lines as well. I don't just mean the rulings across the tablet, but also kind of when you draw a sign, you're actually drawing lines through the clay. And then the other very small handful of Cypro-Minoan tablets we have come from Ugarit, actually. And so Ugarit is a Bronze Age site in Syria, which was predominantly cuneiform using. So we have very large archives of documents from Ugarit that are written in both Akkadian cuneiform, so the kind of Mesopotamian ideal in a sense, and in a local variety of alphabetic cuneiform in which the local Ugaritic language is written. But also you have these isolated examples of Cypro-Minoan tablets. The pictures here are so small because I was trying to show you basically that they're even smaller than the ones on the last slide. And even within this tiny corpus of the tablets from Ugarit, and there are also a couple of labels as well, there is a huge difference actually in the ways that signs are executed on these tablets, which makes them look a little bit kind of experimental. But those are certainly very interesting. Again, I've given close-ups just to sort of see what I mean when I say that they're written in different ways. So the one on the left, you can see that sometimes the stylus is being drawn through the clay, but often kind of rounded impressions are being left. And some of those rounded impressions are quite sort of flat looking, which is quite interesting. the ones on the right, the tablet on the right has a slightly different method of inscription, which actually seems to involve very minimal drawing of the stylus through the clay. It mostly consists of making impressions with the tip of the stylus. Compare that to the last slide, where the Enkemi tablet on the left has, again, something quite similar, where there seems to be quite a lot of impressing going on. And remember that these are signs at a very small scale and can be measured in kind of small numbers of millimeters. So there are some lines being drawn, but a great deal is done by simply impressing the tip of the stylus into the clay. Okay. Now, at this point, I thought it's useful to have a look at what a cuneiform tablet looks like from Ugarit. Actually, it's quite hard to get good pictures of cuneiform tablets from Ugarit, but this is, I can't remember where I found it, hence the lack of a caption, but this is probably the most famous abecedarium from Ugarit. So this has the Ugaritic alphabet, so the alphabetic cuneiform sequence written out. And really I wanted to include it so that you can see how the signs have been made. So essentially each sign has been impressed into the clay. There isn't really any drawing of the tip of the stylus through the inscription. And remember that cuneiform stylus is likely to be pretty different in shape from what was used for Cypro-Minoan. So, well, there's quite a lot, I think, to say about the potential shape of a stylus for Mesopotamian cuneiform writing, and specifically for cuneiform writing at Ugarit, which I won't go into in very much detail, or any detail really. You know, we know that the idea of a stylus is kind of the stylus cut from a reed, which then has an angular end. There are sort of different views in scholarship as to whether you have a triangular cross-section for some or all cuneiform style, or in some cases you have square-ended ones. And that's not really my area, so I won't go into that in detail. But what we can say is that you could make impressions like this with either a triangular or a square-ended stylus. And essentially what you do is to sort of sink the corner into the clay at an angle, and then you use the angle with respect to the surface of the clay to make the wedge shorter or longer. And there are various sort of manipulations you can make in order to render a wedge going in a particular direction, and then to render a kind of complex of wedges to make an individual sign. Okay, now that brings us on to some experimentation. At this point, I want to mention that quite a lot of the things I'm saying at the moment derive from a lot of thinking I did last year in a relationship to an article I was writing with my cruise colleague Philip Boys, who is, as I said before, focused on writing at Ugarit. And he's been quite interested in sort of the context of these examples of Cypro-Minoan at Ugarit, and what we can sort of understand from, you know, those documents appearing at Ugarit. And together we were sort of thinking about possible interactions between Cypriot writing and Ugaritic writing. Now, I did mention that in Cambridge we're really keen on experimentation, and Actually, I really have to say that it has made a huge difference for me anyway in studying these writing systems and practices, to really think about how you interact with the document you're trying to write, with the implement you're trying to write with. Because I think you sort of, you know, when trying to reconstruct what happens when an ancient person writes something down, have to imagine that there are lots of things going on for that person when they write. So, you know, they're probably trained to a degree. They probably already have some conception of how to go about the writing, but they may be thinking about what shape to make the tablet they're going to write on, how to fit in the information that they need to fit in. And that surely takes experience, actually, to plan exactly what size and shape your document needs to be, and, you know, how large or small the signs need to be on the document. But they're also going to be thinking about other concerns as well, such as, I don't know, getting their hands dirty. How do you spell this particular name that they haven't come across before? You know, all of those things are going on, and that's why I think varied approaches to writing are really important when you try to reconstruct what goes on when someone writes something down. Now, so experimentation. I found it very useful to try different kinds of stylus to try and work out exactly sort of what is going on when you write on clay in sit promonoan. Now, one thing that I think is quite interesting is that for those early inscriptions, so this is a picture of me inscribing a sort of reproduction of a clay label, which is maybe reasonably close in date to the early tablet that we saw, the same one that is on the right in this picture. That's not the real thing, that's my version of it. And what I found when trying to make replicas of those two documents is that it definitely paid to use a flat implement, like a bladed implement. What I did was to cut down a plastic knife to the shape I wanted it to be. And actually, I think that was probably quite a useful substitute. Obviously, plastic is not going to be a thing that ancient people used, but it is quite a good substitute for something like ivory. And we do have ivory styli surviving from the Aegean. Okay, styli in exactly this kind of shape where they have a sort of bladed and slightly angled end. And I'm pretty convinced from writing these two documents, the one on the right here, not the one on the left here, and this one, that a bladed implement may well have made these incisions. On the tablet on the right here, I'd particularly draw your attention to this sign. Hopefully you can see my cursor circling it. This is the one that looks like a linear A K, like a sort of wheel shape. And what is striking is that it hasn't been done in a continuous line. So the circle, if this were linear A, you would expect it to have been done in a continuous line, or maybe in sort of two curves meeting each other. This one has actually been done in what looks like a series of small, quite straight incisions. And it looks to me like that may be a product of using a kind of bladed implement. I think that's quite interesting, actually. Now, we don't, as far as I know, have any surviving styli from Cyprus of this shape. In fact, styli are very much absent from the archaeological record. Not just here, I mean, we don't have any for linear A either. And for linear B, we have very little evidence of this kind. So in terms of trying to reconstruct what the shape of a stylus was, we're mostly left to do that from the shape of the impressions that it makes in the clay. For other Cyprominoan inscriptions, so for the later ones especially, maybe 14th and 13th century onwards, we can definitely see that for Cypriot writing in clay, a different shape of stylus is now being used. And this is definitely a rounded implement. On the right here, you can see a close-up of some cocktail sticks that I have used for trying to kind of recreate Cyprominoan writing, where I've tried filing it down to different shapes. The top one, the one that's most pointed, is better for writing linear A than it is for writing Cyprominoan. If you try to write Cyprominoan with that, you get just completely the wrong kinds of impressions. And it kind of, it sort of throws up bits of clay around the sides of the incisions. The one at the bottom is actually the one that I used for most of my experiments. So this still comes to a point and it's still rounded in cross section, but it has a very short taper. That is to say that it comes to a point, but very close to the point it widens out, so you have a much wider kind of section of the stylus, not very distant from the point. And that is very much key to understanding the kinds of impressions that are made. So it has long been noticed that the shape of signs in a lot of Cypriot inscriptions made in wet clay, and that includes the clay balls as well, which make up quite a sizable proportion of the corpus, have strokes that are made of these little teardrop shapes. It's quite distinctive, especially on the right. I think you can see them quite well in the tablet from Ugarit. But you can see them on the left too. So these are shapes where it's sort of pointed at the top, and at the pointy end, the impression is deeper. And then towards the end, like the sort of bottom end, you then have a much more rounded shape, but that part of the impression is then shallower. And that tells us a great deal about how the writing implement has been impressed into the clay. I've left here on the bottom right some cuneiform wedges to compare, because I think the comparison there is actually quite constructive and instructive. So what must be being done is that you can impress your stylus into the clay at different angles. If you hold it at a higher angle in respect to the surface of the document, then the point will sink deeper and you'll have a sort of shorter impression. Whereas if you hold it at an angle that makes it closer to the surface of the clay, then the point won't sink in as deeply. And the rest of the impression may be a bit shallower, but it will also be longer. You sort of have to experiment to see how that works. And this raises my final point, which is about whether there is some kind of interaction going on between Cypriot writing on the one hand and cuneiform writing on the other, in the case of these clay tablets. So specifically, I'm thinking of the ones from Enkemi that date to the 13th and 12th centuries BC, so not the earliest one, and the ones that were found at Ugarit. It was suggested by Emilia Masson, again, so the same scholar who was responsible for trying to kind of divide up the whole writing system into different traditions. She thought that her CM2 category that is the 13th to 12th century tablets from Enkemi. She thought that they were in some sense cuneiformized, and actually in more recent scholarship that idea has been quite strongly rejected, or at least modified. There's been much more of an emphasis on looking towards the Aegean origins of the script, and perhaps a kind of sense that if you say that Cypro-Minoan has been cuneiformized, it perhaps detracts from that, or it sort of detracts from the autonomy of Cypro-Minoan writing. And the point I wanted to make is that I don't really think that's the case at all. I think we can't deny that on the part of at least some people writing in Cypro-Minoan, there is both knowledge of and interaction with cuneiform writing practices. And remember too that Cyprus is kind of bound up in supra-regional politics in the late Bronze Age. So we have these diplomatic letters in so the Amarna letters in Egypt, there's some in Ugarit, some in Hattusha. So we have this impression of kind of Bronze Age diplomacy between these different areas. And Alashia, which we believe, or most people believe, was the name of Cyprus in this period, or perhaps some part of Cyprus. It could have been a place on Cyprus, I suppose. But a place called Alashia is very much bound up in these kind of diplomatic comings and goings. And those diplomatic correspondences use cuneiform. Okay, so they use generally Akkadian cuneiform. There are some sort of variations here. The work that I mentioned before, the collaborative work that I've been doing with my teammate Philip Boys, will kind of include a bit more on this when it's published. So I won't kind of go into that in too much detail now. But we certainly know that Cyprus must be aware of cuneiform writing, and especially at Ugarit, we can be really certain that those Cypro-Minoan documents, which were found in cuneiform archives, that they must be existing within a very kind of cuneiformized setting. Now, that doesn't mean that Cypro-Minoan has been aggressively cuneiformized. I think quite the opposite. It would be much better to think of this as a kind of cultural interaction, exposure of Cypriots to cuneiform writing, and perhaps a kind of experimentation. So, you know, if you're trying to write in Cypro-Minoan, but you're doing it in a context in which lots of cuneiform is being used, well, what would happen if you tried using quite cuneiform methods of inscribing to write your Cypriot signs? One of the issues there is that you can't really escape from the fact that Cypro-Minoan as a writing system has a lot of signs that have sort of quite linear shapes, with curves and lines that you can't completely get away from. And actually, I think there is a considerable degree of experimentation there in terms of sort of thinking about how you get from signs of that shape and then try to write them in such a way that you're kind of doing something more like. And I would say that there is considerable creativity and distinctiveness as well in those Cypriot choices. And that is a really important point, because we shouldn't see this as cuneiform dominating Cypriot writing. We should see this as Cypriots making quite dynamic and active choices about what they're doing. And I hope that shows some sort of interesting areas of interaction and interesting areas where Cypriot writing can be viewed from both systemic and linguistic and archaeological and practice-based approaches. And that is where I wanted to finish. Thank you very much all for your attention. And yes, thank you. I'll stop there. And sorry if I've gone on for quite a long time as well.
No, don't worry, Pippa. This was great. Thank you so much. It's been such a detailed account of the writing practices and what you're doing with experimentation in Cambridge, which I actually have to say I forgot to mention, because all your experiments take place also in this wonderfully lively blog that you keep, which we will link when we edit the video, which shows us what you've done with recreating writing as it were in a sort of a modern laboratory, and show us how the ancients may have written their own documents. I'm going to start off with the questions now, and I take pride of action first, if you don't mind, to break the ice. I have a lot of questions, actually, given my interest in Cypriot, and I wanted you to please perhaps expand on the context in which, I know you don't want to talk about it too much because it's forthcoming, but the way in which Cypriot is used at Ugarit, because on the one hand, you rightly pointed out how different it is from the Cypriot Cypriot, i.e. the one that was produced and created on the island itself. But maybe we should distinguish a little bit, given the fact that the corpus is very tiny. Of course it is in Ugarit, but it's also very, very different. We have very different types of written material being used, written media. We have, as you mentioned, tablets, but we also have labels. We have a cylinder. We have several idiosyncratic ways in which these objects were written. And I think perhaps one needs to be very careful in thinking about how the influence of the local community, the cuneiform heavy community of Ugarit, really used writing and may have influenced Cypriot itself. I think we need to, in other words, treat that material in its own idiosyncratic nature, dealing with the ways in which each document was written and the ways in which the script with its highly idiosyncratic shapes in Ugarit was actually used. So my question is, to what extent can we actually distinguish this process of impact of the cuneiform world onto the Cypriot in Ugarit? Because I think we need to be very careful when we say, well, cuneiformization, yes, but to what extent? And by the same token, the autonomy of Cypriot epigraphic tradition, which needs to be, again, contextualized in its own little different idiosyncratic ways.
Yes, I very much agree with you that we really need to be careful when thinking through these issues, especially because we just have such small numbers of inscriptions and they're so different from each other. So yeah, even at Ugarit, that tiny little corpus of Cypriot inscriptions, everyone is different from every other one. It's very interesting to sort of see. I don't know. I mean, sometimes I think that possibly that does point towards Cypriots being relatively kind of experimental with what they're doing. I think there's an open question of, were these things written at Ugarit or not? My view is that they probably were, I think.
But all of them? I mean, we can't really, because again, I would like to stress this, because some documents in Ugarit really look Cypriot, using the Cypriot Cypriot. And I'm talking about 2 tablet fragments, which really point in the direction of Cyprus, both in terms of the fabric of the clay and also in terms of the letter shapes, the shapes of the signs. And if we contextualize them archaeologically, we see that in the Yabnino house, in the little palace, there was a lot of dealing with Cypriot affairs and trades and merchants being heavily involved in exchanges with Cyprus. So one could assume that those were sent from Cyprus to Ugarit. But on the other hand, we have, for instance, the intact, very tiny tablet from Rapanu and his house and his archives. And we know that he was a very prolific scribe who was like a polyglot, and he may have been experimenting with Cypriot. And it so happens that on that very tablet, coincidentally, we have so many signs that do not quite match up with what we expect of Cypriot to look like in terms of sign repertoire. So that again points in the direction of some experimentation having happened. Maybe Rapanu picked up his stylus and tried and write Cypriot names, although he betrayed his own experience and exposure and familiarity, which was again automatic with the cuneiform epigraphic inscription. So autonomy and the influence of cuneiform needs to be seen on an ad hoc.
Yeah, I think sort of one point I would make is that I sort of try to avoid the word influence, because I think in some ways that gives a very different impression from the one I wanted to create. So I think, you know, we often think of cuneiform writing practices as having this kind of influence that spreads out from Mesopotamia and sort of, you know, affects all of these other areas. And I think we should know really that writing doesn't really work like that. You know, there isn't really a sort of power in the cuneiform writing. What there is a kind of idea attached to cuneiform writing practices, whether that is to do with what you think they're used for, how you think they work, whether they look like they're useful. And I think we have to sort of think in terms of not influence so much as people sort of seeing the attractiveness in something about these writing practices and thinking about how to adopt them, how to kind of adapt them for their own purposes, maybe just how to pick up sort of little features. Like, so I mean, one issue, and this goes for the Enkemi tablets as well as ones found at Ugarit, is that when you're writing on such a smaller scale, that obviously affects the ways that you can then interact with the clay, and it makes the idea of moving your stylus in a more cuneiform way much more attractive. And I think you're absolutely right that we have to think of each of these examples as having a very different context, maybe a different person, I mean clearly a different person, sort of working in a different context to create a different effect for different reasons. And I think you're quite right to separate the contexts in which these are written, and to think of different people responding to different kind of stimuli, let's say, rather than influences.
Yes, but it still leaves the question unresolved of what is Cypriot in Ugarit doing, and who is responsible for having written what they wrote, and to the extent whereby we can gauge whatever the subject matter was, and are we dealing with letters, which is what has been suggested in the past, or are we dealing with particular documents that were written locally? So I think the implications of all of this in terms of practices really opens up to the bigger question of why is Cypriot so incredibly unhinged, if you like, or decentralized in its writing practices, as opposed to the cuneiform, which is much more, we cannot deny that, regimented, normalized, institutionalized, especially at Ugarit. Whereas Cypriot really does its own thing, especially on Cyprus, where you see, as you very rightly and splendidly showed, the extent by which the epigraphic variety and the paleographic variety is was evident, was incredibly vibrant and vital, really. So this begs the question of why was it not institutionalized in the same way as writing at Ugarit was, despite the many languages being recorded? And on the other hand, why is it not as regimented as the Minoan Linear A of the late Bronze Age? So
yeah,
it's true that Cyprus does its own thing and it's autonomous to the extent whereby we can see this writing variety, but the big implication is how was literally playing out in the second millennium BC, at the very end of the second millennium BC. And clearly there's another big question, which is the one related to the administrative practices.
Yeah,
because on Cyprus we don't have the big palaces of Minoan times, of the Neopalatial time. There seems to be a hierarchy. So where is the administrative staff, really? Was it written on perishable material? We don't have as many tablets as we would like to see, and we clearly work on the analogy of what is happening in Ugarit and in the Levant at that time, and what is happening in the big palaces with their archives. So Cyprus does its own thing, that's clear. So we have so many unresolved questions in terms of how literacy worked, the normalization of written practices worked, the way in which the structure that allowed writing to be disseminated in the way that it was, because we can argue that literacy was to an extent quite extensive. But we don't know the mechanisms whereby all of this was regulated and why we see so little regulation of the little that we see. So big questions. I'm sure there are many more to come. So I'll leave, sorry.
If I can just respond very quickly to that. I think it's very true that we have in Cyprus something that is really different looking from other contemporary areas. And yes, when we look towards the Aegean, we think of palace civilizations. When we look towards the east and to Anatolia as well, of course, we think of traditions that have very entrenched bureaucratic training in place. And for Cyprus, in some ways, I don't think it's a bad thing just to think of it as very different. I mean, the archaeological record completely points in that direction, having quite decentralized power structures. Of course, Enkmi is both special and kind of, in some senses, overrepresented in the record, which leads to probably an imbalance when kind of looking at the island as a whole. But in some ways, I don't think we should be too surprised if Cyprus looks very different. And sometimes I wonder whether we would be better off not thinking in terms of these centralized administrative kind of models and thinking more about the way Cyprus looks later on, with, again, very decentralized kind of power structures and, regional power centers. And similarly, the way that alphabetic writing spreads across the Mediterranean in the first millennium BC, again gives you this kind of model for, what does it look like for writing to spread in a context where it's not necessarily linked closely to scribal training, to kind of centralized bureaucracies. And yeah, I think it pays to kind of keep an open mind about,
absolutely. It does, absolutely. We shouldn't use a paradigm of Mina and Crete to gauge what it was that ruled the mechanisms of control or prestige on Cyprus. Yeah, but the implications are huge in terms of sociocultural connections, really. Internal connection and external connections. I'm sure there are plenty more questions. I'm going to shut my mouth.
Yes, can I ask a question?
We have Miguel.
Yes, please.
Hello. Thank you, Pippa, for your very stimulating talk on, well, on a topic that is so dear to me, and for making it so broad, touching upon so many interesting issues. And I know you wanted to avoid those hot issues in the field, the problems with the sign repertoire and the division or the classification of Cypro-Minoan into 3 or 4 subscripts. But the topic is so dear to me, as you know, that I can't avoid, once I've heard your observations, asking a couple of questions that related to these issues.
Of course.
The first
one. You knew it was coming.
I'm sure she did. Seeing the observations you made on some of the clay tablets and the similarities that we find between the, let's call them the CM2 tablets from Enkami and some of the material from Ugarit, and also realizing, as you and Sylvia were saying, that there seems to be so much variety, almost like if there was a decentralization in the use of Cypro-Minoan. Seeing this, what do you think are the implications for the classification that we have had so far, and which is so debated? Isn't it time that we start reconsidering the separation of Cypro-Minoan 2, since there are so many similar things on those clay tablets when compared to the Ugaritic ones? And when you were showing the sign repertoire, well, my sign list, you mentioned very well that certain variants of signs are very different. We can suspect they are the same sign, but they are so different. And one of the reasons that I think will agree with me, one of the reasons they are so different is that sometimes they were writing very small signs with different techniques on the tablets, and it was impossible for them to have so many curves and so many details. Do you think we need to consider more these questions in our reassessment of the sign list? And another related question is, you brought the example of that sign from CM0, which stands in the middle between linear A K, the linear A K syllabogram, and Cypro-Minoan sign 25. Seeing the experimentation you did with the writing techniques, don't you agree that we can see how, for example, that sign became an open shape of a kind we sometimes find already in linear A, became an open shape and developed into Cypro-Minoan sign 25? And can't we consider similar processes of development in Cypro-Minoan that would lead to a better understanding of the script, and also help us understand what kind of script exactly they were using at the CM0 time, so to speak?
These are very interesting questions. And yes, I mean, in one sense, okay, so yes, I very much agree that if we pay attention to paleography and we think about writing methods and how writing methods themselves affect the shapes of signs and kind of the possible shapes of signs because of the implement you're using, because of the scale at which you're writing, and so on, then we absolutely need to factor that in to trying to kind of draw up a list of Cypro-Minoan signs. Now, of course, on the one hand, you don't need me to do that because you've already been doing that yourself, and very successfully too. And I think, you know, what you have already done has very much shown that, you know, when we pay attention to these factors, it does give us more to go on in terms of working out how to narrow down that repertoire and how to work out you know, that contentious issue of, you know, are these two different shapes the same sign but different sort of variants, or are they two different signs? You know, that is a problem that has been present from the beginnings of SCRIBO Minoan, and I think there are still remaining issues, and there are sort of various, I suppose, you know, because there's quite a large number of signs, since it's a syllabic script, any one scholar may have a sort of whole range of different opinions about individual signs, how to classify them, and so on, which of course has been a sticking point in SCRIBO Minoan paleography from the beginning, that, you know, everyone who encounters it then comes up with a slightly different version. But I think it was very good in practice to kind of move away from, so when thinking about the system, okay, since I was sort of trying to divide up kind of system and practice, but then kind of make the two kind of work in conjunction. But when thinking about the system and trying to work out what that overall number of signs is, and sort of what the different shapes are, how many individual signs we can count, it is clearly very, very important that we take those sorts of considerations into account. And of course, I'm not the first one to point it out, and lots of other people have done so, including John Daniel back in the 40s, when he sort of set us all thinking about, you know, what does it mean for a SCRIBO Minoan sign to be written in a different medium using a different method. So yeah, I think it's very important that we kind of think away from these kind of separate classifications of whole systems of signs in the Amelia Masson mold, and move towards thinking practically, like, how do we reconcile the differences between these potential variants of signs, and then to go into some detail in sort of factoring that in. So, you know, when you're trying to write a sign that in a much more linear attestation might be composed of curves and lines and so on, when you try to write that at you know, this kind of tiny scale, as very similar scale to the way that cuneiform is written on tablets, and you're trying to distinguish it from the signs around it as well, and you don't have ruling on the tablets, so, you know, you're trying to keep it distinct from the signs on all four sides of it. You know, how do you then keep the shape of that sign? What does the sign boil down to? You know, does it have kind of obligatory features that must be represented in some sense? Those are really important questions. I think the one place where I would probably just differ slightly is in that I don't always feel confident in making those judgments because of just the very small amount of information we have. So yeah, but that is more a matter of kind of quibbling on individual signs rather than kind of denying the whole methodology, which are clearly right. And yes, specifically on that Ka 25 sign, I think one thing that is potentially interesting is this idea that perhaps different implements are being used at different stages of SCRIBO Minoan writing, which is something I'd like to look into a little bit more, actually. But I mean, if I'm right about that, then that sort of implies a growing tradition that changes in some sense. Though, of course, at Enkemi, we also know of there being some kind of administrative disruptions. So whether you then get different groups doing different things over time, I mean, who knows sort of how that spins out. It is really difficult to reconstruct what SCRIBO Minoan looks like at the time when that CM0 tablet is inscribed. You know, there isn't really very much you can do.
There's nothing that you can do.
That kind of lack of information. However, I suppose you could extrapolate from the idea that there may be changes in writing implements and methods to suggest that you know, this kind of opening, as you say, of sign 25, and it's kind of acquiring a sort of line at the bottom, those sorts of features, maybe that could be related to using quite like a bladed implement at the beginning, and then the layout of the sign over time becomes quite different looking from what it had been in linear A, and then when you're writing it with like a rounded stylus, you're not even thinking of trying to do a circle because it's no longer kind of circular, if that sort of makes sense.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Of course, I've been working on it, but I can assure that the purpose of the question was not to draw any more attention on what I've been doing.
I didn't think that at all. But
I do find very important to, sorry, I do find very important to have a dialogue.
Yeah, absolutely, very much so. And I think it's only right to draw attention to your own work on this, which I hope is in process of publication.
Hopefully soon, yes. Hopefully this year.
Wonderful. That would be great to see.
Even though these are very hot issues and there are many different views among, well, the few of us that are devoted to investigating supraminoan.
Yeah.
I think we will all agree that things are changing in the last years and views on supraminoan are changing. And I think it's important to have a dialogue. For example, we'll now have these new tablets, the 2 tablets from Pila.
Yes, which is so exciting. They're wonderful. Yes. Yeah, they really are.
Of course, I can't help but ask, are we going to
see them in publication?
No. Are we going to keep calling them CM1? Are we going to say these are CM1? You gave the best, I think, what is the best definition of supraminoan one that I've ever seen published, which is basically a catch-all for anything that is not supraminoan 2 or classified as supraminoan 2 or supraminoan 3. And so when we have such a small corpus, but now get to have 2 more tablets, I can only wonder, are we going to continue to classify them as supraminoan 1? Are we going to revise our views on these things? What are we going to do? And I think the dialogue is very important.
I think it really is. I don't know. I'm not involved in the publication and don't know what those publishing it will decide. But I do know that, you know, they will be part of the kind of digital corpus that is being planned. And I don't know. I hope that we try to move away from this idea of just classifying them at face value as one thing or another. Because, you know, I mean, those tablets from Pila are classified in the same way as the cypriminoan clay balls, as the cylinders, things that are paleographically very, very different. And, you know, it's only right that we sort of try to move away from unhelpful catch-all terms.
I can only completely agree. Thank you, people.
I think there's a question from Drew Longacre, who raised his hand. Unless that was a mistake.
Sorry, were you talking to me? My internet broke off real quick.
Yes, I think you raised your hand, so I assumed that you had a question.
Yes, I did. Sorry, my internet would cut off real quick.
Okay.
I'm very much interested. This is really fascinating. I work in later materials. I've been working recently on script interactions in the Greco-Roman Mediterranean world, and I'm very interested in the kind of parallels you're bringing up here. And I noticed in your discussion with Sylvia there that the word ad hoc kind of came to mind. It's an ad hoc exploration of what these interactions could entail. I'm wondering, in your studies, have you looked into broader models about cultural encounters and interactions and the ways those might help illuminate script changes? I mean, what kind of models or situations might allow for or encourage these kind of script changes and interactions in ways that might be more generalizable. Not that we have necessarily some absolute theory that describes all changes, but comparative models. For me, it's very interesting when I see, you know, these Cypro-Minoan tablets that show up in Ugarit and they look different. That looks very similar to similar types of phenomena, and yet I'm working in a period where it's very imperial almost. You've got Rome, this great imperial power, and so this cultural dynamics are different, but there's a lot I think we can learn in looking at these situations across different situations. So do you have any sort of models or theories that you find particularly compelling for helping to explain script changes?
That is a really interesting question, thank you. And actually, what you're working on sounds very interesting too. I'd love to hear more about that at some point. So yeah, when I sort of thought up the idea for the cruise project, I must admit that I was sort of thinking that we might find a sort of single answer. Not exactly a sort of single answer, but you know, we might think of a particularly good theoretical way of modeling kind of relationships between different writing systems and different writing traditions. And I have to say that the more I go into it, the more, well, firstly, you get a little bit overwhelmed by just how much material is out there, how many different cases of writing system transference we know of, how different those cases can be. And I think it becomes sort of quite difficult then to think of a model that really does seem useful for all of those possible scenarios. One model that I do, sort of way of modeling that I sort of got interested in early on, was thinking about like network models and ways of envisaging networks of information, of sort of practices and so on. But the more I got into that, the more I found it difficult to think how you would model those. So you might want to do, so for instance, something that has sometimes been tried with writing systems is like a phylogenetic approach, which is to say that rather than a family tree, you sort of build something that is more like a web and shows the sort of closeness or distance of different kinds of relationships between different kinds of features. But what I always find very difficult about that is trying to come up with a model that really accounts for the different nature of the different features that you're then looking at. So for instance, it may push you towards trying to kind of boil something down to differences over time, maybe assumptions about what is a sort of an earlier sign shape or a later sign shape, and to sort of to use that to inform your model. Whereas actually, as far as we know, there isn't really a kind of definite way in which a sign progresses over time. It doesn't necessarily simplify. So then you're left with lots of difficulties over deciding on your parameters. So I have to say that increasingly over time, I've been sort of trying to come away from trying to come up with a model that actually captures everything, and instead kind of trying to pay attention to all of the potential different features that may be of interest, and to see what is of interest in lots of different case studies in order to kind of compare those with what I'm working on. And then I think in some ways there are just so many possibilities that it then becomes very, very difficult. But I would say that, I mean, as I guess I've tried to sort of emphasize during this talk, I think it's really important to just make sure that different disciplinary ways of approaching writing as a concept don't remain in their own kind of islands of scholarship, because in places where you see the meeting of different disciplines, you really see very much more advanced argumentation able to be made. So I'm thinking especially of the Aegean linear scripts, where you really do get meaningful interactions between archaeologists and linguists working on the same material and kind of willing to train up in other areas in order to kind of have sufficient expertise to make those interdisciplinary judgments, which is probably not a very satisfying answer to your question. But I do think really that there are just lots of different ways of approaching written material, and I think it very much does depend on the sort of social and cultural context as well. And because there are such great variables there, it makes it very difficult to kind of pin anything down in a way.
We have a question from Nightingale in the chat who asks, "Dear Pippa, did you try to write with the cut ribs like the ones from Ankeny?"
Right. No, I haven't, but partly that is a problem of not being able to kind of make something similar. I think. I don't know who is Nightingale.
I don't know.
Nightingale here to say hello.
Nightingale. No video is on.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm gonna look into this and remind myself.
George Nightingale, University of Salzburg.
Ah, okay.
It wasn't a nickname; it's an actual surname.
I thought it was a code name.
Great surname.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I'm going to have a look into those again. It's a while since I looked at those objects, but I don't think I could find a good way of kind of recreating them in such a way that I could then try it out. But maybe I should revisit them actually and see.
May I chip in on that one? Because there's a great article by George Papasavas, 2003, in the Report of Cypriot Antiquities about the silent witnesses in writing systems, writing on Cyprus, which sort of suggests that some metal implements and pins and things with a very sharp edge and very thin were used to inscribe most of the inscriptions in what we call now CM1, Cypremina 1, comprising the clay balls as well. So that is a tantalizing suggestion, and I remember being very struck by that article when I read it years ago now.
Because I think that is a really interesting suggestion. When I tried sort of practical experimentation, I found that using something very thin and pointed just didn't work, except for some other kind of what we might call CM1 inscriptions, like ones that are scratched on hard pottery or that are on metal or whatever. Definitely you must be using sharp implements for those, but in experiments anyway, it really didn't work for things like the clay balls and the cylinders.
But you suggest, or you seem to suggest, that ivory implements may have been used, right? Which you kind of sort of counterfeited with the plastic ones, with the blade.
I think I need to sort of look through again, but I couldn't really see good evidence for anything like that after those kind of earlier inscriptions. So I'm thinking like this, CM0 Ankeny tablet, and the clay label that really isn't a weight, and so on. I'm thinking objects like that, they really look as though a bladed implement has been used. But later on, I don't know, for inscriptions in wet clay, it seemed to me that a rounded stylus is the only thing that really worked. But I could probably experiment more with that.
No, it is astounding how we grapple with even the materiality of the writing system and the way that it was written on epigraphic support, because it's so incredibly varied. And do you think there's any parallel in the history of writing systems for such variety? I mean, we're also talking about a writing system which has but can boast a longevity in terms of usage. The diachronic change and development that you were mentioning is really a key factor, but it is tantalizingly varied, and I grapple with the idea of finding a proper parallel for such an extensive.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder whether the kind of first millennium systems, like when you get this explosion of alphabetic writing, in a way sort of helps to think through some of those issues of sort of what does it look like to have a developing writing system or group of writing systems that is then suddenly being used in lots of different contexts. And of course, with early alphabetic writing, you get things that are scratched, things that are painted, things that are carved, you know, when they're part of kind of monuments and that sort of thing. But you do get quite a lot of variety even from an early stage with something like the Greek alphabet. And that is, I think kind of interesting, just in that possibly it's not so much to do with being trained to use a kind of implement in a particular situation, as we tend to think of with sort of writing on wet clay documents, you know, across like the Aegean and the Near East and so on. Possibly it's more sort of, there's a kind of idea of writing as something that kind of can be done in different situations, and the tools you use for it maybe have much more to do with the situations than with the idea of writing, if you see what I mean. And I actually wonder whether that's the case for some of Cypro-Minoan too. Not Cypro-Minoan 2, Cypro-Minoan as well.
As well, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm thinking things like when you get a painted inscription, or, well, okay, not so much for Cypro-Minoan really, or when you get, so something like the gold rings, actually, since they featured on the poster, so it's good to talk about them, you know, do you really think that a different implement has been used to add the inscription at the top from the one that has been used to add the sort of decorative bits at the bottom? Well, no, of course it hasn't.
No, it's the same.
This is one person making a gold ring with the tools that they would use to make a decorated gold ring. And if they happen to write using tools that they would have already been using, then that's not really about writing implements at all. That is about sort of writing being incorporated in a completely different sort of craft situation. And I think that's probably the case for other kinds of adoptions of writing as well. But still, that real distinctiveness of Cypriot writing, and where you get a stylus that just looks like it's not the same shape as anything used anywhere else. I don't know how you account for that. It's interesting. Be interesting to know if there could have been tools of a similar shape used for anything else, for instance. But very difficult to reconstruct.
Great. Any more questions? Nobody at all? I wonder what you think of the transmission of the Cypriot Minoan to the Cypriot syllabary, and that linear B sneaking in the background without being seen, in the big tree and the what you called the convenient fiction that comes with that reconstruction of a genealogy.
Yeah.
Again, another big question. Why does the Cypriot syllabary of the first millennium share up to 8 signs with linear B identical?
I honestly think that they can only have been transmitted through Cypro-Minoan. I know this idea that there could have been some Linear B intervention at some point has occasionally been raised, but I just don't believe it. Not when you look at Linear B and see just how kind of restricted it is in its context of use.
I agree completely with that statement. Completely.
And also the fact that Cypriot syllabic orthography is very different from Linear B orthography. So like when you write a Greek name, say, ending in an S, in Linear B you would leave the S. In the Cypriot syllabary you would put a se on the end to show that there's an S there. Same with the final N in a word. There are different choices over syllabification and so on. And I honestly think that that really points towards Cypriot syllabic writing being developed completely independently of anything to do with Linear B.
Oh, sorry, go on. Sorry, I don't want to interrupt. It's just that I get excited about these things.
No, they are exciting. But yeah, I was only going to add that I think that must mean that the shapes of those signs are well enough preserved through the Cypro-Minoan tradition that they turn up in the Cypriot syllabic script, even if we don't always have very good evidence of that exact shape. So I'm thinking of like pa, for instance, though pa looks quite different in Linear B to the way it does in the Cypriot syllabic script. But I think if you go from Linear A onwards, it's a bit easier to kind of trace that development. But yeah, I think that has to have come through Cypro-Minoan essentially.
And I wonder if you can turn this on its head really and assume that the Cypriot syllabary can really help us in reconstructing and possibly reduce the Cypro-Minoan syllabary.
Now that is a very good question. That's a difficult question as well. I think to an extent, yes, in that there are some signs where it is not difficult to get from the Cypro-Minoan counterpart to the Cypriot syllabic counterpart. So I'm thinking, for instance, of ones like 102 and the sort of similar kind of shapes that sort of go from being more H-like to being more X-like, as it were. And there's just a definite trend there, and it's not difficult to sort of unpick that backwards and to see sort of how you get from the Cypro-Minoan shape to the Cypriot syllabic shape. So in terms of shapes, sometimes there's more work to do and sometimes there's less work to do. In terms of the overall shape of the signary, that is a much harder question when you're dealing with the language unknowns at the Cypro-Minoan end, I think. Just in that you don't know for sure what phonology is being encoded for Cypro-Minoan. And you know, we may have a situation that's not so different from Linear B in respect to Linear A, in that compromises are being made as to how you represent your own phonemes based on the model that you know, you've inherited. It wouldn't surprise me at all. In fact, I think we should assume that in terms of the consonants, for instance, which consonants are represented, the ones that look stable between Linear A and Cypro-Minoan, and the Cypriot syllabic script must also be relatively stable in Cypro-Minoan, even if there is different phonetic reality, you know, whatever the kind of realities of the language that underlies the Cypro-Minoan inscription, language or languages. But yes, I think what I don't, I'm not sure. Yeah, I mean, I think it's right, I suppose, and Miguel has shown this too, that when you kind of use paleographic factors to narrow down the number of individual signs, and of course, Sylvie, you have also kind of talked about this as well, you get closer to that kind of repertoire as it looks in the Cypriot syllabic script in terms of the number of separate signs, and that is probably not an accident, and is probably, you know, a good indication that you're right to kind of go in that direction, to narrow down, rather than thinking of there as being like 100 different signs or whatever. But in terms of details, yeah, I guess you have to go sign by sign in terms.
Yeah, that is a big crux, getting to the Cypriot syllabary.
Yeah,
The Cypriot syllabary in a definitive way.
Yeah, I was going to say that in terms of practice, I think when you start to see the Cypriot syllabary kind of distinctively being a bit different from Cypro-Minoan, you have this interesting mix of there still being some types of inscription that are kind of similar to Cypro-Minoan ones, and at the same time types of inscriptions that are more similar to ones found in the kind of alphabetic explosion around the Mediterranean happening at the same time. And that is really interesting in terms of just sort of thinking about where Cyprus fits in, and again sort of points to Cypriots, you know, not being isolated, as, you know, you should never expect Cypriots to be isolated. You know, it's an island that is of interest to so many people and that has such wide connections, and that is a huge part of its story.
Yes, and the creativity is something that you stressed, and it needs to be stressed as a special in a way, without having a bias or a sort of a Freudian affection to the loved thing. But yeah, it really is quite special.
Yeah.
Great. Do we have any more questions or suggestions? Observations?
If I may, I would just like to underline something. Of course, for us, this is not really anything new, but perhaps for other people listening to this, it might be interesting. In the case of the transition, the possible transition from Cypro-Minoan or some form of Cypro-Minoan to the Cypriot Greek syllabary, of course, we need to take into account that huge gap in epigraphic evidence we have between the 10th and the 8th century BCE on the island.
Yes.
And for me, I don't know how shared this opinion is, but for me, this correlates well with the fact that some of the changes I see on the sign shapes from Cypro-Minoan to the Cypriot Greek syllabary could be very well explained if we assume that writing went through a stage of cursivization when being written with ink. Some shapes do not change much, but others do change in ways that are not easily explained by the use of hard media, but are better explained by the use of ink on perishable materials. And I think this is something to keep in mind for the future.
That is a very interesting point. Thank you, Miguel. Yeah, and I think it's the constant source of frustration for people who work on writing systems around these periods, that those cursive shapes are associated with perishable materials, and they're exactly the things that we will never have. That, you know, it's just incredibly unlikely for them to survive in the places where we want them. And it's so sad, because it would be very helpful if, you know, we just had some glimpses, something to kind of point towards there being traditions that are more likely to be written in kind of ink or paint, or, you know, on materials like papyrus or parchment or whatever. If we just had some positive evidence, I think it would really help with that kind of argumentation. But yeah, I suppose yeah, I try to be agnostic about these things. You know me, I'm agnostic about as much as I possibly can be. But I do think that there's certainly a much better kind of cultural case for there being lots of perishable materials around in that period, as you sort of, you know, go through the early Iron Age and kind of into that period when we're first getting those kind of visible traces of the Cypriot syllabic script. There's a much better case for all of that then than there is for something like extensive use of perishable materials in the Mycenaean palaces, which I really don't believe in. I know there are lots of people who do, who think that, you know, alongside clay tablets in Linear B, there must also have been kind of perishable materials being inscribed in Linear B. It's kind of an academic question, really. More ways than one, but for that period, you know, around the 10th, 9th, 8th centuries BC, across the Mediterranean at least, we have lots more reasons to think that people are writing on more perishable materials, that people are writing in ink. You know, there are other areas of the Mediterranean where we know this is happening. I used to be quite agnostic about Phoenician too, but I really don't think, the more I think about it, the more I think that you can't really understand the development of these very kind of cursive shapes in Phoenician without thinking that there is also a very influential tradition of writing on perishable materials. So yeah, I think I need to think a bit more in detail about individual signs and sort of what might look like a response to cursivization or not, but I like the idea. Yeah, definitely. I'm gonna think about that some more. Yeah, and I think it's a very interesting issue to raise.
Also, it's possibly not an isolated phenomenon in the early Iron Age.
I think not. I think not, and I think in that kind of early Iron Age period, when you suddenly have all of these kind of alphabetic writing systems suddenly around and kind of in contact with each other, and that goes for, you know, Italy and for Phrygia as well as for Greece, and then the Levant as well, you know, all the way down the Levant. You know, I really don't think you can think of any of those practices as being isolated, and I think it's very likely that similar things are happening in those different areas. Each has distinctive kinds of inscriptions, but at the same time there's a lot of kind of cultural interaction there and a lot of kind of similarities in writing traditions.
I was going to mention the case of the Carian alphabet, which is very dear to me because my supervisor, as you know, was Ignacia Diego. And Carian, Sylvia in a recent book has given a very good description of what Carian looks like, because it's as if someone reshuffled the Greek alphabet, and all of a sudden you find the Greek shapes but with the wrong values. And people took this at face value for so long that it delayed decipherment. And one explanation that I find very compelling is to think of Carian as a script that was based on a Greco-Anatolian alphabet, as it seems, but went through a cursive stage before starting being put on stone media. And after going through a cursivization stage that changed the shapes of the alphabet, it again was reshaped when they put it on stone, because they wanted it to have perhaps a more Greek look to it. And again, the shapes changed, and that's how we got there to what we have. Of course, we cannot demonstrate any of this, because when you're doing with perishable material, you don't have it. But I think it's either that, or imagine that they just woke up one day and decided to change all of the letter shapes for some reason. So I prefer to imagine a cursivization process that makes sense in this historical context of the early Iron Age. The same with the Sudetic alphabet as well. It's been proposed by Neumann that It was based on Greek, but went through a cursivization stage before being put on stone.
Yeah, yeah, it's very interesting actually, and I think, yeah, it's very difficult to think through those issues when you get something that ends up looking so different. But essentially, you can't kind of get there without a great deal of reconstruction. But no, I like that idea actually. I'd like to read up on that. What did you say? Who has been talking about carrion and cursivization recently?
Well, not so recently, but I think the reference you would like to check would be Neumann. Neumann's work on the Sidetic alphabet. On the Karen alphabet, I think you might find this on Adiego's well-known book, The Karen Language, but I'll try to think about it.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And John Ray is a good colleague of mine here in Cambridge as well. I'll have to ask his thoughts on it too.
Sure, yes.
Great.
Thank you so much again, people.
Thank you, Miguel.
I think Phyllis had a question. I saw you raising your hand. Yes,
thanks.
please.
Well, you were just talking about how it might change and what might bring about change. Now, I've spent most of my life writing very fast and seeing it develop. And one of the things in English shorthand that changed is it was brought about because of the need to train more and more people, and it had to be easily, flexibly done and easily learned. And I wondered if one of the causes of change might be changes in culture.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a very good point. And I think with kind of developments in writing, it's sort of sometimes assumed that developments will be sort of more top down than bottom up, by which I mean kind of enforced and trained rather than sort of people making their own kind of decisions as they go along. I think, well, in some ways it could kind of be either way. It's a shame that for societies in the Mediterranean, we have so much less information than we do for societies in the Near East in terms of how people were trained. Though also, I guess it's fair to say that in these kind of traditional Mesopotamian school curricula, I mean, it's not my area of expertise, but I get the impression that maybe there isn't so much change. Maybe there's more kind of, the ways of training become very entrenched. And I often think that cuneiform writing is, in a sense, quite kind of exclusive, in the sense that it takes highly trained professionals who are not professionals in writing. Okay, they're professionals in the things that you use writing for, like like record keeping and accountancy or whatever. But they do seem to have things like, very variant spelling, that sort of things. I always think actually that it's really interesting that cuneiform spelling is just so kind of up to the author, as it were. That there is such such potential for spelling things.
Yes.
Why
Can I
have that in a... Yeah,
can
sorry.
I give you a saying that my own shorthand teacher had? Miss Madgwick's shorthand compiled with the aid of Mr. Pittman.
Yes.
There are all sorts of little tricks that go around that people teach each other. So, but there is you have to overlearn it, and you have to overlearn every single syllable, and it has to be fluent. Yeah. But it has to be something that you personally find easy and quick to read. And people have different ways of writing, and then people have different difficulties with their hands. I mean, left-handers for right-handers, for a start, will write differently. Yeah. People with small hands and very close eyesight will write differently to someone with a larger hand and who have got different focal lengths. And some of the differences you see might very well be down to the different handwritings.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And where we have much larger bodies of material, it's really rewarding when you get to actually kind of study some of those differences. Linear B is great for that, actually. I mean, we can do so much with Linear B in terms of identifying what individual authors do and what the kind of idiosyncrasies of their writing are, which may in turn help us to kind of reconstruct, you know, things about them as individuals, whether it's, you know, how well they can see or how nimble their fingers are, or whether they're left-handed. I mean, I haven't done anything on handedness, but I do have a colleague who is really interested in trying to detect left-handedness actually in documents. But I don't know what has come of that. I'll have to ask her more about it. But I think it's very interesting trying to kind of look into those detail features. I think you're absolutely right that, you know, those kinds of variations, however minute, must surely be playing a role. And it's a real shame when you have, you know, bits of attestations of writing that are so strung out and sort of so different from each other that it makes it very difficult to decide whether a difference is due to a sort of macro difference, like lots of people are writing something in a different way because they're being trained in that way or whatever, or it's kind of an individual thing to an individual author. I think that's really interesting.
I think if you had something that had to be broadcast to a lot of people, then it would have to be more uniform. But if it was going to be within a small circle or a small set or even your own records, you could write anything you liked. Yes,
absolutely. And yeah, I think that's a very interesting question in terms of archiving as well. And for Cyprus, I mean, given that we just have so few clay tablets, it's very tempting to think that these are not big archival situations like you get in the Mycenaean palaces, like you get in the kind of Near Eastern archives, that perhaps these are really quite small scale, small numbers of administrators who really have a lot more freedom over, you know, various aspects of the way they write, because of exactly that factor that they may not need to be read back by a large number of other individuals, or there may be less kind of regulation of what writing should look like. Yes, because we've assumed, because they're so old and we've discovered them, that they were meant to be archived over long periods of time. It might only be needed for a generation or 20 years, but like yeah, indeed. So the Official Secrets Act or something, and then they come out into the public domain, and you only have to really archive them for 20 years. Yeah. Well, in fact, in the Linear B archives, it's really interesting in comparison to the Near East, because for Linear B, you never have year dates. There is no way of assigning something to a particular year in which it was written. You do get month names turning up, and then you just get references to this year, last year, and next year. As if they are regularly kind of recycling the clay or destroying the documents as you go along. And that is, again, is really interesting in terms of thinking about the longevity of the information, the intended longevity.
Can I just ask you, when you were doing your experiments, how quickly were you able to write things once you'd practiced them a bit?
Quite slowly still. I think I have a lot of scribal training still to do.
Well, I was just wondering how scribal training might have been involved, because you were saying that they were specialists and that they were accountants and they were merchants and they were this or they were that, and yet they had this particular skill. But speaking as somebody who spent an entire lifetime transmitting those skills, I know how hard that is.
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely.
I mean, did you know that it takes an entire year to teach Pitman New Era, the one that was used to record Hansard? It takes an entire year to learn the system, and another year to get the speed up.
Yeah. Well, I'm a fellow at Magdalen College in Cambridge, and we have the Pepys archive, and that is very interesting in terms of thinking about how shorthand has developed over the years.
But that's one of my real interests, and when I finish my PhD, if I live long enough, because I'm 73 now. I'm a very mature student. But I'd like to look at how Cicero developed and Tyro developed shorthand, because the only thing I've managed to find is somebody who said, well, we don't know whether or not he invented it and then applied it, or applied it and then invented it. And speaking as someone who's a specialist, there is only one way it can go. There is only one answer. He had to have actually developed it and used it a bit, adapted it and done it brute, because you have to overlearn everything to get the fluency.
I can imagine.
Pippa, you have to overlearn. That's definitely that's definitely the future path. Become a modern day scribe.
Yeah. When you're actually learning to teach this, you have automaticity and habit formation and everything. You have to teach. You have to learn how to impart it, and they have to learn it. So every single syllable has to be so overlearned. It's as automatic as our alphabet.
Yes. Yeah.
To use it in the way that Tyro and Cicero used it had to be that way.
Yeah. Fantastic. It's been more than 2 hours, Pippa. Can you believe it? And they flew. They really flew. It's been so exciting to discuss this with you and to hear what you're up to with Cruise. We'll link the blog so that everybody can see this when they see the edited video. And if you don't mind, I would like to say hi to Anna Lucia D'Agata, who's been with us all along. And I know that she participated to other SCRIBO seminars in the audience till the end. So thank you for your patience, really, because they've been long and exciting. Ciao, Anna Lucia. So next time you're going to be one of our guest speakers, if you'd like. Okay. And Esther as well. I've just noticed that Esther is there. Ciao Esther.
Hello Esther.
Ciao Anna Lucia, hai tolto il microfono. Ci tenevo a salutarti. Ciao Esther. And Pippa, thank you so much. This has been wonderful. It really 2 hours and they flew. And hopefully you're going to be a guest of ours in Bologna live this time or next time. Hopefully we're going to be able to see each other again. It's been 3 years. But thank you so much. It's been wonderful. And let's keep in touch. And thank you.
I really appreciated the invitation. It's been absolutely wonderful. And I can only apologize for taking advantage of you saying it would be okay to speak for an hour.
No, it's great. It's great. The longer, the better. It's been wonderful. And it's been a roller coaster of discussion. And hopefully we'll get to the secret syllabary repertoire one day in a definitive format. I would like to thank everybody for taking part. Our next guest is going to be Professor John Baines from the University of Oxford, who's going to be talking about the invention of writing in Egypt, as you would expect from him, but also in China. And his seminar is going to take place in 3 weeks' time on the 8th of July at the same time, 4:30 p.m. Italy time, Wednesday, the 8th of July. Thank you so much to everybody who took part, and we'll see you in 3 weeks. Thank you, Pippa. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Bye-bye, everyone.
Goodbye.
Bye.